So this is dedicated to the 19 victims of the madness of 1692. You've all heard the story, I'm sure, but the version of the story you've heard might not be quite accurate because the story gets kind of warped and twisted over the years. The way the story usually goes, which is mostly accurate, is it begins next door in Danvers, Massachusetts, which back then was called Salem Village. That was Salem Village, this was Salem Town. Two different sections, and I'm not quite sure of the relationship between them exactly. But Salem Village has this new minister named Samuel Parris, a fire and brimstone Puritan preacher. And in his house, he has his wife living with him, he has his daughter, Betty, he has a niece named Abigail living with him, and he also has two slaves, Tituba and John Indian. And the way the story usually goes is that Tituba, who is this Caribbean slave or possibly American Indian slave, the important part for our purposes is that Tituba, she might be Caribbean, she might be American Indian, but the point is that she's other, she's different, she's not one of us, you know, she's different and weird by their standards. The way the story usually goes is that Tituba's looking after the girls, she tells them scary stories, she shows them little voodoo tricks, and the girls freak the hell out. They run around the room, they bark like animals, one of them grabs the Bible and throws the Bible across the room, one of them tries to crawl up the chimney. This is crazy behavior for little Puritan girls when children are supposed to be seen and not heard. And all this is placed squarely on Tituba. She's the one who scared them and freaked them out. I always think Tituba gets a really bum rap in all of this. If two little white girls start acting out, it's gotta be something the black chick is doing to them, right? So I think her status as a slave makes her really easy to blame for what's going on. The local doctor is called in, Dr. Griggs, but he's just a simple country doctor. He's really not able to diagnose what's going on. He says the girls are under an evil hand, there's something supernatural going on. The girls then cry out on several women in the village. They accuse several women in the village of practicing witchcraft. So now the paranoia really starts. People start trying to figure out who the witches are. Neighbor turns on neighbor, accusing each other of practicing witchcraft. Now, I have absolutely no doubt that a lot of the people who got swept up in all this were totally sincere in their fear. They really thought there were witches in Salem Village, that Satan was at large and working through witches to destroy this Bible commonwealth that they were building up. I have no doubt a lot of people were totally sincere about this. I'm also equally convinced that a lot of people were not sincere and saw this as a chance to get back at their neighbors and rectify old wrongs and get back at people. Payback is a witch, as I always say. And if you look into the history of the Salem witch trials, there's a historian named Francis Hill who's done a lot of really good work in tracing out this kind of Hatfield and McCoy feud that's going on in Salem at the time. There are two families who are opposed to each other, the Porters and the Putnams. And the Putnams are sort of old money, comparatively, who are on their way down, and the Porters are new money that are on their way up. So there's a lot of tension between these two families. And when you look at who gets accused and who does the accusing, it breaks down along like who's on the Porter side, who's on the Putnam side of the whole question. Okay. So there seems to be a lot of just local politicking and local resentment going on. But anyway, a special court, the Court of Oyer and Terminer, is set up here in town to hear accusations of witchcraft. And one of the hallmarks of the witch trials is spectral evidence. This idea that witches can use their magic powers to attack people in ways that are invisible to anybody else except the person under attack. So we're sitting here talking, I fall over, I roll around, I go, "Ah, you're a witch, you're attacking with your powers." And you go, "No, I'm standing here, what's wrong with you?" I say, "Well, yeah, you're a witch, you're using your powers, of course." And this sounds crazy to us, but back then, totally admissible as evidence. They're like, "Well, he must be a witch, because clearly there's evidence that he's using his powers against the gig. He wouldn't be rolling around on the ground like that if he wasn't being attacked." This is all completely admissible. And the penalty for practicing witchcraft was to be hanged, to be dragged out to the edge of town and hanged on Gallows Hill. And your body would be left there. If you were a witch, you were not entitled to a Christian burial. So if they hanged you by the neck until dead, which they did, your body would be left out there. because this memorial is here next to a graveyard, people always think that, well, the witches must be buried here, and they're not. We don't know where any of the witches are buried because they're all left out on Gallows Hill. There's tradition among some of the families that they went out to the hill after the execution and got the bodies and brought them home. We don't know that that's true. That's sort of a legend in a few different families. So, none of them buried here. There's no one buried here in this spot. To be accused of witchcraft and convicted on spectral evidence, you had really almost no way to escape the noose. Only way you could get out of this is to confess that you were a witch when you weren't. You know, then to accuse other people of also being witches. So yeah, you're right, I'm totally a witch. So's he, so's he, so she, definitely her. That's the only chance you've got to escape. If you maintain your innocence, as 19 of them did, you'd be hanged. The only way to escape the noose is to accuse other people, throw more fuel on the fire. The witch trials actually spread far beyond Salem. They take up most of Essex County. You didn't hear it from me, but actually Andover, Massachusetts, a few miles from here, has more accusations of supposed witchcraft than we do in Salem.
Oh wow.
Yeah. Over 200 people eventually are accused and jailed on charges of witchcraft around Essex County. The jails overflow, and they start to have to kind of borrow other buildings like barns and hen houses to keep accused witches in until trial. Witches get jailed as far away as Boston because it spreads throughout Essex County. The accusations spread and spread. The accusations kind of work their way up the food chain until the wife of the governor of Massachusetts is accused of practicing witchcraft. The governor steps in and says, nope, game over, we're done. He abolishes the court of Oyer and Turner, sets up a new court. The new court cannot consider spectral evidence as admissible, and once spectral evidence is off the table, one charge of witchcraft after another just collapses. The jails clear out. Up to 20 witches are cleared in one day by the new court because there's just no evidence that anybody was practicing witchcraft, because they weren't. There was kind of a push in the 80s, I think, to claim the people who were accused as Wiccans, but they weren't. They were good Puritans and just innocent bystanders who got accused falsely. So there were no witches in Salem back in 1692. Witches don't appear in Salem until about 1970. So the jails clear out. Tituba is jailed in Boston, and when you were in jail awaiting trial on charges of witchcraft, you had to pay rent for your cell. You had to pay for whatever crappy food they gave you. You also had to pay for the shackles that they used to pin you to the wall. So the whole time you're awaiting trial, the meter's running. And there are some people who, when they're cleared, can't leave because they still owe the jailer money. That happens to Tituba. She's a slave, she has no money of her own. Samuel Paris, her owner, has no interest in bailing her out, and he leaves her there. Then somebody, we don't know who, comes along, bails Tituba out, and takes her with him, and she just disappears. We lose track of her after she leaves Boston jail. And she's bailed out by an ignoramus, and ignoramus is one of those old terms which just means we don't know. We use it now to describe an idiot. He's an ignoramus, but it's an old asylum term. This person's an ignoramus. We don't know what's wrong with them. It's Latin for we don't know. So we have no idea who this person is, and they just disappear with a picture of them. So 1992, 300th anniversary, this space is dedicated. And there's a ledge for each one of the victims, has everyone's names and dates on them. As you walk in, you cross the threshold. The threshold has quotes that are taken from the transcripts of the witch trials, which are stored, they used to be stored one street over, now they're in a warehouse. They used to be stored at the Phillips Library. So they're all protestations of innocence. They're all things like, I know not what a witch is, I am wholly innocent of such wickedness. And those quotes go across the threshold where they're cut off by the wall there, which is sort of symbolic of people's lives being cut short, people's words being cut off. And people like to leave flowers, and there are notes. People have been sticking notes on the walls lately. And I don't read them because they're not for me. But a lot of the time when you come out here, you'll see notes from descendants left on the benches. And then you see people sitting on them, which are disrespectful. John Proctor from the Crucible is right there. Oh, there's also Giles Corey. Giles is the 20th victim of the witch trials. It's 19 men and women who get hanged. It's 14 women, 5 men, plus Giles Corey. Giles Corey is not hanged. When he's dragged up in front of the court and charged with practicing witchcraft, he stands mute. He will not enter a plea. Until he enters a plea of innocent or guilty, they can't charge him. So they do this quaint old English custom. They bring him out into a field, they lay him down, they put a board on his chest, there's just a pile of rocks on the board. This is meant to compel him to enter a plea. So throw some rocks on his chest, are you innocent or guilty? He says nothing. Throw some more rocks, innocent or guilty? He says nothing. The only thing he does say over the 2 days this takes place is at one point he says, "Or wait." And then at one point, he can't say anything because his tongue's turned purple. It's being forced out of his mouth. Sheriff George Corwin, not a nice guy, comes walking over and uses the tip of his walking staff to press Giles Corey's tongue back into his mouth. The good old days. Goes on for 2 days. I should also point out Giles Corey is over 80 years old when this happens. But after 2 days, it's too much. The weight crushes him and he dies there in the field, never having been tried. Never having entered a plea of innocent or guilty, so he's never officially tried, even though he's the 20th victim of the witch trials.
Didn't he turn his wife in or something? Or?
Yeah, right there. Yep. Yeah, he turns his wife in.
Yeah.
Because he wants to. They live a little ways out. I think they live out in Beverly, which is Salem Farms at that point. It's Salem Village, Salem Town, Salem Farms. And he wants to ride into town to see what's going on with the witch trials. It becomes kind of a spectator sport. She hides his saddle so he can't ride into town to see what's going on. And then that kind of pisses him off. And he says at one point something about he thinks that she's practicing witchcraft because he can never say his prayers when she's around. He can't concentrate. So it's clearly not a real happy marriage. Yeah, he turns her in. And then he gets accused. So it's a mess. One of the theories you often hear is that it was all ergot poisoning. Ergot is a mold that grows on grain, and the theory goes that grain gets wet, it gets this ergot sprouts on the grain. They use the grain to make bread. Ergot has hallucinogenic properties. People are hallucinating. That's why you think that your neighbor is flying through the air on a broom. And this is the theory that everyone always asks about. It's the theory that won't die. I went to a symposium on the witch trials in June, and this came up. And Margot Burns, one of the historians, said she wants to do a presentation that she'll call A Fungus Among Us, disproving the ergot poisoning theory. It's a great, sexy theory, but it just doesn't hold water at all. And she and some of the other historians were saying, like, that theory was busted the next day when it came out. But it's a fun explanation that people like, so it won't die. There's also, you know, one of the theories is like, oh, they're all evil Puritan religious fanatics, so this is what you get when you mix religion in, and like that doesn't really wash either. There's also well, it was just the evil patriarchal phallocentric men trying to get rid of all the uppity women. That doesn't really wash either. So there's a lot of moving parts, but a lot of it really seems to come down to old enmities, the people crying out on each other. There were a lot of old court cases that those two people had featured in years before. So just a lot of, we've lived next to each other for 20 years and we can't stand each other, and now I can get rid of you. You know, so it's not as sexy an explanation, but it's kind of more horrible in a man's inhumanity to man kind of way. So. It's Justice John Hawthorne. It's Nathaniel Hawthorne's great-grandfather. And he was one of the judges during the witch trials. So he sat on the court condemning witches. There were several different judges, all heavily involved. But he's kind of the one everyone always knows because Nathaniel Hawthorne, and also because in The Crucible by Arthur Miller, he's kind of like the chief heavy. So everyone kind of focuses on him. Even though he did a number of things throughout his life. He was a general, he was a merchant, so a very successful guy, which is why he gets to be a judge. It's like, hey, you're smart and successful, you're a judge now. The nifty thing I always think about these old New England gravestones is that if you're much smarter than me, you can date them just by the design. Like this up here, which is called the tympanum up on the top. A design will get popular for 10 or 20 years and then get replaced by something else, like as fashions change. So it's like the death's head becomes a cherub, and then 20 years later the cherub gets replaced by like a weeping willow. So if you really know what you're doing, and I'm not one of those people sadly, you can date them just by looking at the design. And this is usually somebody's second job is to carve these stones. They're so gorgeous and intricate, you would think, well, this is got to be somebody's primary thing. But no, it's usually like a blacksmith or a carpenter who does this on the side. It's amazing. John Turner comes over from England, an indentured servant, comes to Salem, goes into the merchant business. Salem is very successful at trade with the Far East, Africa, and John Turner gets into that line of work, gets very rich enough that he buys a house from a widow, expands the house, puts a gable on the house, expands the house again, puts a couple of gables on it, and a gable is just a pointed end roof like those. He dies, it passes on to his children. The children continue to expand the house. They build a couple other extensions, a couple of more gables. Eventually the house has 7 gables. House eventually goes to another family who's related to Nathaniel Hawthorne. Nathaniel Hawthorne is visiting this house where his cousin lives, and the cousin, there's more remodeling has taken place over the past few years. They lose a couple of the gables. Hawthorne's cousin says, oh, you know, this house used to have 7 gables back in the old days. And Hawthorne says, ooh, 7 gables, a house of the 7 gables. I like it, I'm gonna use it. So he uses that for his second novel, The House of the 7 Gables, which is based on the house, which is still standing down on Derby and Turner Street. But the book isn't set in Salem, it's set in one of our old New England towns. He's clearly talking about Salem, clearly talking about that house. In The House of the 7 Gables, he is using some local history because there are witch trials connections in The House of the 7 Gables. In the novel, one of the guy who wants to build the House of the 7 Gables accuses a neighbor of practicing witchcraft. So the neighbor gets executed, the guy can buy the land cheap and build the House of the 7 Gables on it. Before the neighbor is about to be hanged, he says, if you hang me, God will give you blood to drink, to the accusing neighbor. He's hanged, and in the novel, when the house is opened, you have a grand open house. Everyone come see my brand new house on this land that I stole by getting somebody executed. And when people come in, they find that the owner of the house, the guy who built the house, is dead, and blood is pouring out of his mouth, God having given him blood to drink. This is based on Sarah Good. Sarah Good is this old beggar woman, one of the first people to be accused, and when she is about to be hanged on Gallows Hill, the edge of town, she looks to Reverend Nicholas Noyes and says, if you take my life away, God will give you blood to drink. Noyes gives a command to her to be hanged. And when Noyes dies, quite some years later, there's blood coming out of his mouth, God having given him blood to drink. So Hawthorne knows this story and uses it in The House of the 7 Gables. So even though it's not specifically, like, explicitly set in Salem, it's like really clearly set in Salem. Okay. So the house is still standing. You can take tours today. So.